Hello, everybody. Just joining us. We'll wait for a little while longer until the room is full, and then we'll get started. Hi, everybody. If you're just joining us, we're just going to wait a little bit longer until the room is full up, and then we'll get started. Well, there we go. It's 2:01. I think we can get started. So first of all, hello, everybody. And my name is Chris Kilford, for those of you that I don't know or you don't know me. And I'm the president of the Canadian International Council branch here in Victoria on Vancouver Island. And I'd like to welcome, first of all, our CIC members. And I know we have some guests today and our guest speaker. And I'm glad that you could take the time out today, because I don't know what the weather is like outside of Victoria, but it's bright and sunny today here in Victoria. Before we get underway officially, it's important to recognize that CIC Victoria members live, work, and learn on the unceded Coast Salish territory, and we give thanks to the Lekwungen people, now known as the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations, for allowing us to meet on their traditional lands. For those of you that aren't familiar with the Canadian International Council, we are an independent, nonpartisan, membership-driven think tank with the express mandate to engage Canadians on international affairs. And what makes us different from a lot of the think tanks is that we have branches in 18 Canadian cities with some 1,400 members. You may have heard me say before we had 17 branches. We have 18 now with a new branch based around Barrie in Simcoe County. You can find out more about us by Googling the Canadian International Council, where you will find a page on CIC Victoria. And if you are a guest here today and would like to join, please do get in contact with me. I'll put my email in the chat later on so that you can do that. We have almost 430 members here on the island with just over 100 students. And quickly speaking on a couple of things, as an organization, we've just finished the largest deliberative democracy exercise ever held in Canada, where we brought 420 Canadians together over 2 days to discuss Canadian foreign policy. And we're currently looking at all the results of that, and we'll be publishing and talking about those results in the near future. Another little great thing that's just recently happened is 12 of our student members at UVic, members of the Model United Nations Club, took part in a 2-day virtual Model UN conference at New York, held in New York City, and they represented the country of Gabon. So they were playing Gabonese diplomats and had to put in all their position papers representing that country. And we had our ambassador to Gabon speak to them before they took part in that conference. It went really well. They were very excited. And as an organization, we paid their membership, their subscription fee to join in that conference, and that was almost $2,000. And that was, we were only able to do that because of the members of CIC Victoria who are taking part today. So thank you, everybody, for that. Now, for today, and after I introduce Dr. Torek, Dr. Torek will speak for 20 to 25 minutes, and there will be some slides, and then we'll have an audience Q&A. And for the Q&A, most of you are used to this now. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen that you can use. You can type your questions in there, and we'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. And we are also recording this event for the folks who couldn't take part today. So we are delighted to have Dr. Torek here today. Heidi, it's great to have you here. And it's going to be about your book, News from Germany. And you'll see folks in the audience that we've very cleverly positioned the book over our shoulder so you can see the book. We have, or I have, 3 copies here. And after the talk today, we'll be using a random number generator to see who of our CIC Victoria membership will receive one of these 3 copies behind me of Heidi's book. So that'll happen later today. Now, as for Dr. Torek, she is an associate professor of international history and public policy at the University of British Columbia and a member of the Science and Technology Studies program and the Language Science Initiative and the Institute for European Studies at UBC. Heidi is also a visiting fellow at the Joint Center for History and Economics at Harvard University and a non-resident fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, plus the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Her writing has been published in English and German in major magazines and newspapers at home and internationally. And Heidi appears regularly on national radio and television in the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, and Germany. Heidi received her BA with honors in modern and medieval languages with a double first from Cambridge University and earned her MA and PhD in history from Harvard University. And like I said, Heidi, we're delighted to have you here today. And so really looking forward to this, and I will turn the floor over to you.
Thanks so much, Chris. Thanks for the invitation. It's truly a pleasure. I wish I could be there with you in person in Victoria. I've had the chance to go a few times, and it's always a pleasure to go over to the island. I'm joining you from Vancouver, from the traditional unceded and ancestral territory of the Musqueam people. Okay, I'm just going to share some slides with you, which should now be visible. Chris, give me a thumbs up if you can see the slides. We're all good. Okay, so this is going to be mostly a history talk, but I promise you at the end, we're going to get to these questions of what are the parallels of the present? And one of the major things that I try to do in my work is to think about how can we use history to help us understand what is precedented or in fact unprecedented about our contemporary moment, where we suddenly find ourselves spending an entire year online, all thinking deeply about how social media has or hasn't seemed to threaten democracy. While many of us seem to make the claim that this is an unprecedented moment, I'd like to think, as I tell this historical story, what seems resonant and what doesn't. And one of the funny things as I was working on this book, which I worked on really for basically a decade, was that I ended up doing something that most people don't, which is putting even more quotes in from people at the time to show that the parallels that I was seeing were things that people at the time were actually saying and doing. They weren't things that I was retrospectively imposing on the past. So as I say, I'll take you through some of this history, a little brief overview of some of the things I look at in this book, this history of how Germans tried over the course of nearly half a century to control world communications. Then I'll end with some ways that I think there are important parallels to the present so that we can talk about both the past and present in the question period. But I'd like you then to just cast your minds back to March of 1917. The United States is about to enter into World War I, and you would think that German magazines and newspapers would have plenty of things to polemicize about. But in fact, one major satirical newspaper called Kladderadatsch decided to devote an entire special issue to polemicizing against a particular type of business, the news agency. So in over 40 pages of cartoons, poems, and newspaper articles, they polemicized particularly against British news agencies. So here's just one example. And this cartoon, the caption says in German, "Die Lüge ist der Weltgesetz. Dies lehrt das Reuter Kabelnetz," or "Lies are the law of the world. Reuters cable network teaches that." And here we see a somewhat anti-Semitic depiction of Reuter as a green gremlin who's gnawing on the world. And from his sharpened fingernails stretch these cables, the telegraph cables that are purportedly spreading lies from Britain around the world that are poisoning people against Germany. So what I do in my book then is to really figure out, well, how is it that even by 1917, lots of Germans are very obsessed with this particular business, the news agency, and with its power to spread news around the world that purportedly poisoned other people against Germany? And how is it that Germans of all political stripes seized on news agencies and then on new technologies to try to overturn this state of affairs that they thought was so detrimental? So part of how do we get to this story is about the modern ways in which news was created and looking behind the scenes at the networks behind the news rather than at the newspapers themselves to really understand where are the bottlenecks of power in news provision. So news agencies first emerge in the mid-19th century. They emerge at basically the same time as submarine cables. And what they basically do is station correspondents around the world who can send back news over telegram, which is then sent on to newspapers that can then package that news for their readers. One way to think about this system is that news agencies are like news wholesalers and newspapers are the clients. Now, there were very, very high fixed and sunk costs to being a news agency. Telegrams are very expensive. It's obviously very expensive to station foreign correspondents around the world. And so this meant that there was a very, very small number of news agencies that were supplying news from around the world to newspapers. To give you a really concrete statistic, by the 1920s, 90% of German newspapers, that's 90% of German newspapers, did not have correspondents even stationed in the capital of Germany, Berlin. They relied on news agencies to get all of their national and international news. So most of the time we're thinking about news, we often think about the New York Timeses of this world, the London Times, Globe and Mail, etc. But the truth is that those were the exceptions in how people got their news. Most of them, they thought they were reading their local newspaper, but their national and international news was coming from news agencies. So as I've said, very high fixed and sunk costs is this real bottleneck of how many news agencies there were. And in fact, there's just a tiny handful, which is why the cartoon that I showed you is polemicizing against just one British news agency, because there was one major international British news agency. So news agencies begin in 1832 with Agence Havas in France, which is the first modern news agency. In 1848-49, there were revolutions in the German lands. Two Jewish men, Bernhard Wolff and Julius Reuter, they flee to Paris. They work at Agence Havas. And then after the revolutions are over, Bernhard Wolff goes back to Berlin. He founds a news agency, and Julius Reuter, in anticipation of the first ever submarine cable between Britain and France, goes to the UK and founds his own news agency. So these three news agency owners, they know each other, they recognize these economic problems of news collection I've just described, and they decide to form a cartel where they divide the world between them. So each of those news agencies collects news from places that are part of the empires of those countries or that seem somehow culturally or economically affiliated. So they station their correspondents there, they gather all that news, swap it with the other three major news agencies and deliver it to their respective newspapers. This is an astonishingly long-lived cartel. It's often forgotten about, but it's what really dominates the reporting of national and international news throughout the entire world for 70 years, from the mid-19th century all the way up until the outbreak of World War II. Now, this was a system that if you look at the places that are getting covered, primarily means that Reuters and Havas, the British and French news agency, were the ones that were gathering most of the news from around the world. Now, initially, this was fine with German political elites like Otto von Bismarck, who was the chancellor who helped to create a unified Germany in 1871. But as the 19th century goes on, many Germans came to believe that they needed an empire. They became much more imperially minded. They believed that Germany, as one foreign minister said at one point, needed a place in the sun. And as they looked towards this news agency cartel system, they came to believe that this was a system that was boxing Germany in, that what you really needed was to ensure that German news agencies could disseminate their news through many more places than were created through this cartel system. That kind of discontent from imperially minded Germans dovetailed with Germans who were getting involved in the Second Industrial Revolution, which was really the Industrial Revolution where Germany's products like chemicals and so on were being exported around the world. And a lot of these industrialists, as German exports became more and more important to the German economy, said, well, this news agency cartel is also boxing us in. It is creating really problematic asymmetries of information because we can't get news out to places like Latin America and East Asia directly without the British and French news agencies intervening. And simultaneously, we can't get the type of news that we specifically need because it's being gathered by British and French correspondents. So as Germany moves through and the percentage of its world exports increases, these German industrialists become more and more frustrated with a news agency cartel system that seemed to stymie their export ambition. So they see this news as an economic problem. And finally, these political and economic anxieties, they dovetail with technological anxieties. So you remember that cartoon of the submarine cables around the world. This built on an anxiety about what submarine cables were actually doing. So in the initial stages of submarine cables, this is just seen as a pretty neutral technology. Most of the submarine cables are laid by British-owned companies. But from the 1890s onwards, the Germans, the French, the Americans become more and more concerned that the British will use these cables to censor content. For many Germans, this seems to be something that is confirmed during the Boer War around the turn of the 20th century, when the British do seem to be censoring material from South Africa sent back to Europe. And German suspicions are raised even more when the British subsidize what is known as an all-red line of submarine cables around the world that only touch on British imperial soil, with the final link that is between Vancouver, where I am, and Australasia. So in response, the Germans and many others lay cables that duplicate these routes so that they can have something that is secure. But Germans also believe that there's problems with this technology because in the case of war, these cables could simply be cut. And so they decide to invest in a new technology that will bypass cables altogether, which is wireless technology. So the German state intervenes and it forces two private companies, AEG and Siemens and Halske, to form a joint research and development subsidiary called Telefunken, which would invest in creating wireless technology that could be created by Germans and used to circumvent the entire British submarine cable system that I've just shown you. And this then would be a way of getting news from Germany out directly around the world, even if a war were to break out and submarine cables were cut. So Germany invests heavily in this system. And by the time that World War I breaks out, there are actually German wireless towers stationed all around the world, which help to connect the German empire that has been built up in the interim that is actually quite far-flung, including with islands in the Pacific. This system is really not very well known. It's basically never talked about because it's only completed a couple of months before World War I breaks out. And actually, most of the global World War I battles that happen in the first year of the war are by the Allies trying to capture these German wireless towers. For example, one of Australia's first battles is over the island of Bitterpacker to actually capture one of these wireless towers. The same two of the battles in the African continent, most of them are initially to capture those wireless towers and also German colonies. So rather than giving up on wireless technology, what this seems to Germans is to actually underscore the need for this kind of technology. Because one of the first things that the Allies did when World War I broke out was in fact to cut all but one of the cables, the submarine cables that connected Germany to the outside world. So from the German perspective, what you then had to do was invest even more into wireless towers. And so by 1917, what had happened is that the Germans had actually built the tallest wireless tower in the world at a place called Nauen, just outside of Berlin. And there were all sorts of plans that I write about in the book of subterfuge and trying to erect wireless towers in neutral countries, in Paramaribo, in China, at one point thinking about Mexico, so that Germans could get their news out around the world. Because a firm belief takes hold during World War I that this is one of the ways that the Allies were able to undermine Germany, was because the British and French had much more control over news. This was why neutral countries had gravitated towards Britain and France. And so Germany had to try and counter this system. It really accelerates those other beliefs I was talking about that sprung up before World War I. And they all seem to these German elites to be confirmed by what happens during the war. So German elites want to use this wireless system I've just described to put German news out there, and they want to use the business of news agencies to do so. They want to influence the news that is happening before it even gets to newspapers at all. So for them, the hidden nature of this is what's really important. You control the news before it even gets to readers, so they don't even know that this news is from Germany, and that will influence them even more. So what I do in the book is I look at a whole bunch of different news agencies and how different German elites try to use them. Obviously, I don't have time to talk about most of them today, so I just want to focus on one of them, just to show you how incredibly widespread this system is. So when people have written about German propaganda, for example, during the Weimar Republic, the democracy of Germany in the interwar period, or about the Nazis, they've often written about radio, written mostly about Europe. What I'm going to show you in the next 10 minutes or so is that actually this news agency system was incredibly global. And it tells us a very different picture of how much German news actually reached people around the world and what a long-standing project this was. So I'm going to talk to you then about this fifth news agency, which is called Transocean or Transocean. Now, Transocean was founded in 1913, just before World War I breaks out. It's founded by a coalition of political and economic elites who believe you need to use this new technology of wireless to disseminate news from Germany around the world, particularly to places like Latin America and East Asia that need to, they believe, hear news from Germany directly. The people who are involved in Transocean are extremely high level. So it includes people like Gustav Stresemann, who will go on to be a chancellor during the Weimar Republic and a major foreign minister for 6 years in the 1920s. It also includes Hjalmar Schacht, who will go on to be briefly Nazi economy minister and president of the Reichsbank. So these are very, very high level individuals in politics and in economics who are involved in creating this news agency, who believe that news is fundamental to Germany's political, economic, and cultural power. When World War I breaks out, Transocean's main focus is on trying to disseminate news to the United States, which at that point is still neutral. And prior to World War I, you might have noticed on that map of wireless towers, Telefunken had erected 2 wireless towers on the east coast of the United States. And because the US was still neutral, Germany could actually send news still to the United States. Now, basically, the narrative up until my book was Germans send propaganda to the US. It was fairly useless. It didn't reach anybody. And one of the things that I discovered actually, looking at the amazing corpus of digitized newspapers we now have, is that through news agencies, German news actually reached a huge number of people in the United States, millions and millions of them all throughout the US. So this is a map that I made myself. Here's where the wireless tower is. Here are all of the different newspapers in the US who during that period of neutrality were citing news from Transocean. And this wasn't just small items. Often they would be front page news. This is just to give you one example. This is the Ogden Standard. Ogden is in Utah. You can see here there are 3 front page stories that are actually taking news from Transocean. So how people in places like Utah understood World War I was not just shaped by news from Britain or France, but also news from Germany as well. It's just that most of them would never have understood that because they didn't get that this news was coming through a news agency. Now, the Allies recognized the importance of this kind of wireless news because actually in the Treaty of Versailles, there was a clause which forbade Germany from sending news from any of its wireless towers for 6 months after the Treaty of Versailles was signed, with the idea that you could prevent the sort of thing that happened here. For bizarre reasons I've never been able to uncover, actually, the Allies decided to list which wireless towers the Germans couldn't use, and they left one off of the list. So the Germans for 6 months were sending news from one tower called Eilwiese. And even though Germany had now become a democracy, the Weimar Republic, democratic politicians continue to really invest in this system. And they believe they needed to use Transocean to send news from Germany around the world, to make clarifications about things they didn't like about the Treaty of Versailles, and to prepare for a world where Germany could re-enter the international community. And this type of news, in fact, drew the irate reactions of all sorts of very important people, even very early in the 1920s. So in 1921, for example, a major press baron, Alfred Harmsworth Lord Northcliffe, who had founded the Daily Mail and the Daily Mirror in the UK and had also bought up the then ailing London Times, goes on a trip around the world. And he is, of course, being a good British baron, sailing on a British ship. And he is completely shocked and horrified to discover that the news that he receives on that ship is actually news in English sent by Transocean. So as soon as he landed in Sri Lanka, he grabbed one of his London Times correspondents and he tells them that he's absolutely horrified about this and exclaims that Germany may not have money for reparations, but she is expending immense resources in propaganda in the Far East by daily wireless from Berlin. This sets off a chain of stories in the Times, in newspapers in France, all the way to Japan, about how Germany is still engaging in propaganda. And it actually also sparks a line of questioning that goes all the way up to the British Prime Minister, asking why the British aren't reacting to this type of news service from Transocean. And actually, this sort of questioning is what helps to create the foundation of the BBC, to ensure that there is British news that is sent both within Britain and then also around the empire. The Germans who are working on Transocean are very pleased by this type of reaction because they believe it shows the importance of continuing to send news from Germany around the world. They continue to invest in it, and that means that by the time the Nazis come to power, there is a global system they can build on. So that much of what the Nazis are able to do, of course, they dramatically change the content to be horrifyingly anti-Semitic, racist, nationalistic, and fascist. But they can build on this infrastructure that had been built over the course of the previous 20 years. So you can see here that Berlin is at the center, still sending a lot of news to ships that had so angered Lord Northcliffe, also focusing on those places like Latin America and East Asia that German industrialists had prized for 30 years, and also trying to create connections with what had been former German colonies lost during World War I, that the Nazis actually in many ways try to maintain a connection with and seek to regain. So the Nazis will build on this system to disseminate a huge amount of content, and they'll actually be surprisingly successful. So I'll give you a few examples of that before we talk about parallels to the present. So the French, for example, who traditionally were supplying news to Latin America, are horrified by how Transocean has used wireless to send news much faster than the French could. And so they end up building their own wireless towers in Buenos Aires, which really transforms what the city looks like. So you can see here these rival wireless towers. The Soviet Union tries to send its news agency into China and is extremely unhappy to discover that, in fact, not just the British are there, but also Transocean. And it calls Transocean a dangerous element for the interests of peace between the USSR and other powers, particularly in the Far East. And even the United States, before the US will enter World War II, becomes hugely suspicious of Transocean. And this is one example of, I think, the joys of archival research. I honestly never expected when I went to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., that I would be looking for evidence of Transocean and I would turn up files where the major character would be J. Edgar Hoover. I mean, maybe I shouldn't have been surprised because he did a lot of things in his time as director of the FBI, but it was truly a surprise to me. And I think, shows the tremendous value of the kind of archival digging that we get to do as historians, that we suddenly find these incredibly famous characters being involved in stories of news. So in the case of J. Edgar Hoover, he came to believe that Transocean was not just a news agency. He believed it was actually a cover-up for the largest Nazi spy ring in Latin America. So he gets very upset with Transocean, and he ends up putting 2 Transocean agents on trial for being foreign agents who had not registered under the Foreign Agents Registration Act that he had helped to create, in part to stop what he feared were fifth columns of Nazis in the US. And in fact, this is where the law began, the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Initially, it gets used mainly against journalists. After World War II, it lies dormant for a huge amount of time. And then over the last few years, it's actually been revived and used against some Chinese media outlets to require them to register under FARA, and so to RT Russia Today. So actually, the origins of this law that are being used against China and Russia is actually in this period that I write about. And then finally, I just want to demonstrate to you, these weren't just fears. Actually, a huge number of newspapers were printing quite a substantial amount of news from Nazi Germany, even though many of their readers might not have realized it because it wasn't always labeled as such. So this is just show you in 1941, the large number of newspapers in East Asia and Latin America printing news from Transocean. And in fact, even in places like Japanese-occupied China, we often think that the Nazi and the Japanese spheres of World War II were quite separate, right? We call it the European theater, Asian theater. But in fact, in news, there was huge competition between the Germans and the Japanese. And extraordinarily, in places in Japanese-occupied China, sometimes the people there were reading more news from Transocean than they were from the Japanese news agency Domei. So for many people living in Japanese-occupied China, their view of the world was shaped more by Nazi news than it was by Japanese news. So given that all that I've described, it's perhaps not surprising that when the Allies finally conquered Germany, one of the first things they want to do is destroy the news agency system and the propaganda system completely. So wireless towers are bombed, and all of the news agencies I've described are immediately dismantled. In West and East Germany, there are, of course, news agencies, but they by no means exert the kind of power that I've described here. Even on reunified Germany, the DPA, the Deutsche Presseagentur, the German news agency, is one that mainly served Germany and isn't really a player on the global stage anymore. However, that doesn't mean that the world of news agencies or many of the things that I describe aren't still relevant to the present. So many of the news agencies I talk about, like Reuters and the Associated Press, still exist, but so do some of the mechanisms. One of the bizarre things that happened as I was writing this book is that in many ways, the present caught up with history. So within Germany, there started to be demonstrations by far-right groups against immigration, for example. And one of the things they started to do was to use terms that had come from the Nazi period, like Lügenpresse or lying press, or Systempresse to denigrate what they saw as a mainstream press. Some of these terms then made their way over to North America, and so might be familiar to you from the world of 2015, 2016. So there are many ways in which this past has come back to haunt us really very specifically. But there are also ways in which there are, I think, parallels between the story that I'm telling and the present world that we exist in, some lessons we can learn and perhaps talk about, and particularly given that, of course, that the CIC is thinking about foreign policy. So the first is that a lot of the story that I'm telling is an economic one. You probably didn't think a book about news from Germany was going to talk about things like fixed and sunk costs. But in fact, what I discovered when I was writing this book is it's really a business history, right? It's a history of how and why news agencies became these bottlenecks of news, and how it was that they could be controlled and subsidized by governments in different ways. So one of the things we need to think about when thinking about our present media environment as well is, what are the bottlenecks of information provision? What are their business models? And how does that potentially make them susceptible to foreign interference or hate speech and so on and so forth? So just as news agencies were relatively unrecognized in some ways as the bottlenecks of information provision from the mid-19th century onwards, so too sometimes we, I think, don't realize or only recently really come to grapple with how companies like Facebook or Google are the bottlenecks of information provision. Now, of course, there's much more ability for each of us as individuals to get our information out there. But major social media companies frame and control the ways that we can do that. So it's important that we think about what those bottlenecks mean and how that potentially makes them susceptible to different types of manipulation, just as news agencies were in the past. The second thing that this history, I think, shows is that we can't really think about this just as a content problem. Again, if I call a book News from Germany, we don't necessarily think that it's also going to be a story about infrastructures like submarine cables or wireless telegraphy. But in fact, what we see is that the German elites in the past, they invested in wireless technology specifically for geopolitical reasons to try to bypass British submarine cables. And that helped to determine how much they really invested in that system. So you see a real interplay between that infrastructure, state investment, and the types of goals that the state, in this case, Germany, had for information. So in many ways, it was a puzzle for me that it took so long for us to have these discussions about the role of 5G, the way in which technological infrastructure around information really does have something to do with geopolitical rivalries and power and investment. And discussions around 5G and Huawei are, I think, a really key part of that. And it's more a mystery as to why it took us so long to have those conversations rather than why we're having them at all. And the third thing that I'll mention is this question of geopolitical rivalry. So when we start to see foreign interference, these questions were brought up, maybe particularly for those of us looking at the US or UK in 2016, but also much earlier in some other countries. Often this was portrayed as if it was a fundamentally new problem, or people maybe pointed back to the Cold War. But actually what the history that I've written really shows us, I think, is a totally different perspective on this. I think it shows us that information warfare or rivalry, whatever we want to call it, it's a feature, not a bug of the international system. The 1990s in many ways is the exception, when we have less of this kind of information warfare. In fact, it's much more of a feature of the international system that we often haven't paid as much attention to. And so if we see it as a feature, I think that flips our perspective to understand it's something we're going to be grappling with for some time. There isn't one silver bullet to fix it. Rather, it's more a feature of how international systems function when you have rivals and you don't have that one global hegemon. So with all of that, I'm going to say thank you. I look forward to your questions and to discussion, to take questions about the past, but also to take questions about the present, because I spend a decent amount of my time talking with Canadian and other governments about what are the policy solutions we can find to some of these problems in the present. So thank you very much.
Heidi, thank you so much for that. I was following your every word. It's fascinating. I love my history too, and I often find the lessons there, and we just sometimes miss them. But everything you were saying, and when I was reading the book, things that came out, I was reading about Germany in the 1920s, and I was thinking, hey, this is like Fox News. The parallels were remarkable, and I do have some audience questions coming in, but one aspect that I wanted to talk to you about was the delivery of news into the hands of people that you talk about in the book, because it was one thing to gather the news, but you actually had to get it into the hands of people. And what I found quite interesting in your book was the fact that the newspapers were producing multiple editions every day and getting breaking news out onto the street in 15 minutes. And I don't think we really appreciate that happened back then. We tend to think that we're the ones today who have instant information, but in fact, back then it was the same.
Yeah, I think, that's one of the things that I spend a lot of time really trying to delve into, is exactly how long did things take, and really trying to put myself back into the space of, all right, if I lived in Berlin in 1920, what was my news really like? And that for me was one of the most interesting discoveries, right? Because it's our sort of impression that news has just gotten faster and faster and faster over time. And I think it's actually a much more complex story. It depends a bit on where you live. So in some ways, it's easier for me to avoid news now than it was in the 1920s, because one of the sort of amazing things that would happen, right, is some newspapers had 6 editions a day. It was just unreal. Or if there was really important news, they just print a 1-page extra. And then they had news boys, they were basically all boys on the street who would be hawking those newspapers. And so they'd be saying, you can think in the classic films, right, extra, read all about it. But you would be hearing that kind of stuff on the street, which is obviously not something we have in cities in quite the same way anymore. But I can really prove by digging into the sources that if it was a really important piece of news, it could go from being sent to the office to being on the street within 15 minutes, which is, obviously a smidge slower than what we have now, but not that much. And I think it reminds us that actually, if you were living in a city, you had this real sense that news was coming at you very fast. And that, the disappearance of those multiple editions of newspapers has been obviously replaced with our social media world. But it's not such a simple tale of things were slow in 1920 and now they are fast. It's that it's kind of changed in a host of ways. But actually, I could, sitting in Vancouver, happily avoid news in a way that I probably couldn't have done in 1920, because I'd just be hearing it when I went on the streets.
I have a question from Nikolai in Toronto, and it ties into the newspaper that you showed, the Ogden Standard, and you had that map with all the little dots showing how German news was disseminated across the United States. And so Nikolai's asking, how did German news agency executives try and measure the impact of their news in the populations they were looking to influence. Because as he says, today we have likes and shares and engagements and views, but what kind of metrics do you think they may have been using back in, say, the pre-World War II period, or even before that?
Yeah. Oh, Nikolai, it's such a great question that I grappled with a lot, because it's also part of trying to explain, why did they become so obsessed with news? They had to have some belief that it was having an impact, and how did they try and measure it? And so one of the things that's changing over this period of time is different beliefs about how you measure the impact of news. So I'll start with that kind of Ogden Standard stuff, and then I'll do a little a little bit of a sense of how that measurement stuff changes over time, because you could even subtly see it in my presentation and the sources I could show. So basically, in that kind of period in World War One, what happens is that they didn't actually have as good a grasp as I do of all those newspapers, right? Because they couldn't actually subscribe to all of them. So what they did have was people in the Washington and Washington Embassy and New York Consulate monitoring newspapers there. And they knew that this news was being sent out, but they actually didn't have as firm a grasp as I do on how many newspapers are printing it. So they certainly were sending back every 2 weeks. And this just shows you how important this was. They were sending back reports every 2 weeks that went to the German chancellor, saying that this stuff was being printed, and also telling them that it had arrived. Because otherwise, if you just sent it via wireless, you weren't 100% sure it had arrived. So they were saying it had arrived. They were trying to give a sense that it was important. And they tried to give some impression of what they thought were the reactions. So for example, they said things like, look, stop sending things that are society news or about opera. Nobody cares about that stuff, and it's not getting printed in the newspapers. And part of the reason why Germans were trying to send this is they wanted to prove in this propaganda war, when the British and others were painting Germans as brutes, they wanted to prove that Germany had culture, right? So they were sending things about opera and so on and so forth. And then people elsewhere were saying, look, no newspaper is printing that stuff. It's a complete waste of time. So that was basically the level of feedback that they had at that point. Into the 1920s, that starts to change a bit. And that's in part because Germany then, after World War I, when the blockades are lifted, has more access to international newspapers. And they start to rely on things like newspaper clippings from different newspapers to judge impact. So that story of Lord Northcliffe, right? I have that because what they did is, in these German ministries, they collected all the newspaper clippings as evidence that this had impact. So they were tracing that at the time. So that's the way they were trying to measure it in the 20s, is which newspapers are printing it. They saw that as evidence that this was influencing the public. And then finally, by the time we get to the late 20s, early 30s, we get the development of a whole science trying to think about measurement. So this is kind of the long precursor of likes and so on, is that finally advertising professors and others start to think, well, how can we measure what the audiences of newspapers are thinking? So they start doing surveys, start to develop. Then in the 30s, we'll get Gallup in the US. This is the period of really developing audience research. But that hasn't fully hit in Germany at that point. So by the time we get to the Nazis, what they do is they're very meticulous about counting the number of words. They're very excited about that. So the reason I can tell you things like about Nanjing is because there is somebody sitting in Nanjing who is a Nazi who is counting the number of Chinese characters in the newspapers that are coming from Transocean versus coming from Domei. And so that's where I can get that kind of stuff from, because what they believed is the amount of news was a proxy for power. And of course, we know now that's a very flawed way of thinking about it. But these are the sorts of ways that this evolved over that period. And of course, it's very difficult for us to assess how many people who read something actually believed it. In retrospect, it's very hard to find. But that's basically the thought of ways that they were trying to measure those questions.
Oh, that's perfect. Thank you for that. That's a perfect answer. So interesting. I can just imagine somebody in an embassy looking into the newspapers and doing exactly what you say. I have a question. I have a couple of questions actually from Hugh Stevens, who's a past president of CIC Victoria. And Hugh asks, so the example that you have of Germany establishing its own news agencies, it's very much like what we see countries doing today. Al Jazeera, you mentioned RT, China Global Television, BBC, and others, but we seem here, Canada seems to be a little bit behind the times, perhaps, or we've moved away from Radio Canada International. Is this a problem for us? is there a Canadian story that we should be trying to tell people?
Yeah. Oh, it's a great question, isn't it? Because it's one of those things. I actually have a master's student who's now working on the history of Xinhua, the Chinese news agency, and how and why it decides to go global from the 1970s onwards, and what Xinhua thinks of as global, and so on. So it's a fascinating story because it's another way of trying to talk about global influence and how countries understand that, right? That we see this whole slew of countries that at a certain point come to see news as a really important sort of tool in the arsenal of having, we can call it soft power if you want. And that's true for Qatar, which alongside the football and all sorts of other things, Al Jazeera is really sort of the precursor of that. And you can also see that even Turkey, actually, Turkey's news agency is a whole host of countries that do this kind of thing. But what is, I think, also fascinating is that we haven't necessarily seen that from the Canadas, Australias, those kinds of democracies haven't necessarily seized on those tools. And I think part of the reason for that is historical, right? That when the BBC is created, the BBC from the early 1930s onwards also has BBC Empire. So in a way, those kind of Anglophone Commonwealth countries come under that BBC umbrella for a long time, which I think helps to explain part of why that doesn't emanate from those sorts of places. And then by the time Canada has its own independent foreign policy, the question of whether you then want to also establish other types of media is another question. And I think then maybe thinking about our contemporary world, it costs a lot of money to staff this kind of thing, right? It's a loss leader, and you do it for other reasons if you're now creating it for the first time. If you're the BBC and you already exist and you're very well regarded, it's actually a very cheap tool of soft power, to be honest. And sometimes when certain languages are cut, I sort of wonder, well, that versus some of the other tools is actually quite cheap, but it's quite expensive to create it from the ground up and to have your correspondence all around the world. And I guess one of the things that's interesting, though, that I haven't thought as much about is it doesn't seem to affect the perception of Canada. When we look at soft power indices, Canada actually performs very well in them by using other types of tools. So it tells us that news is one way you could try and go about this, but it's not a sine qua non, that Canada still commands quite a lot of respect. If you look at soft power indices where people in countries around the world are asked to rate which countries they think are doing a good job. So it just shows us news is only one method of many.
Yeah, I think you're right. In some ways, I think the airwaves are full. Today, if you're traveling internationally, especially, you turn on your television in your hotel room, you have access to everything you can imagine. Everybody seems to have a channel, and they're all looking to influence you in some way. But when you look at polling data about how Canadians feel about China or Russia today, it's not that good. And so you wonder. As you say, about how much do you want to sink into that kind of information service. Hugh has another question here. He says you compared the role of news agencies back then to social media companies today, like bottlenecks of information. And as he says, and as you point out, the news agencies back then, they invested a lot of money into the collection of news. But these days, social media companies tend to ride on the content of others. So we've got Google and Facebook and so forth. Do you think they should be paying for news content because it does bring them advertising and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the key debates that is happening. And you could argue, actually, they already are now paying to a certain extent, depending on which country you're in. Google actually has paid quite a lot of money in places like France to subsidize news. There's just been a deal in Australia, right? So they're actually already paying in some ways, or they're starting to be forced to. So obviously, that's one of the ways that these companies were able to expand so very quickly, is that they got a lot of that news provided for free. But some of the news agencies that I'm looking at, they also rode the coattails of others and got some of that news for free as well. So I think the question for us to think about with social media companies is a bit of the chicken and egg. So how much of the problems that we see in the media infrastructure and system were caused by social media platforms and how much of those problems existed before. So at least, if we look at like revenues for newspapers and others, they start to decline from the 80s onwards. So it's also a TV story. And then it obviously is just on steroids once you get online advertising. And it reminds us that most of the time, readers never pay the full price for news in newspapers. Much of it was subsidized by advertising, right? And that is, I think, just a crucial insight for us to remember, so that if we're now trying to get users of newspapers to pay the full price, it's going to be a heavy lift because we don't really have historical examples of large numbers of people paying the full price for that news. There have always been different types of subsidies, and advertising is one of those subsidies. So what this world looks like now, obviously one model that's being put on the table is that because social media companies are profiting from the types of news being created by news companies, that they should contribute in some way to that news. One model that's obviously on the table. But I guess I would say what we see is those revenue declines were happening even before social media companies. So we can't quite put all the blame on them for what is happening. And that one other thing we need to, I think, be a little bit wary of is what I call golden age nostalgia. So the tendency to think that news was fantastic, then social media came along and now news is terrible. But actually, it's actually quite rare that you have this period when newspapers are so incredibly profitable. They're like this license to print money, basically, from the 50s to the 80s, and that goes away. But pre the 1950s, that wasn't true. And now it's not true afterwards. And the other thing we can say is, newspapers represented a certain group of people who were able to be journalists and able to write the news. And do we want to have a world that's actually more pluralistic and diverse, where all different types of people have the chance to tell news, tell media, make stories? And is that the kind of world that we want to see, rather than trying to somehow like shoehorn things back into the 60s and 70s, where there were a lot of foreign correspondents, but there were a lot of people who were absolutely excluded from the possibility of telling their stories and doing investigative journalism. So I guess I see it as one where let's separate a little bit news from journalism. News we want to have, but maybe we want a different type of journalism for a 21st century Canada. And I think that can be a really good example of, without having, a Canadian equivalent of the BBC, having a very diverse, robust media landscape is a great thing for a democracy. And we're still figuring out how to get there.
Thank you for that. I have a question about the Britain's all red line that you showed, 1902, and the map. And when I was looking at that, it sort of reminded me of China's Belt and Road Initiative. And then you mentioned Huawei and 5G, and it kind of all put things into perspective for me. I was wondering what your thoughts were about how Huawei has rolled out its products around the world. Is it a case of just getting market share with low-cost products, or is it some geopolitical rivalry that we're just not seeing, and that China wants to dominate the news, if you like, in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a it's a complicated question, right? To say, what's exactly in the minds of people in China. But I'll offer a couple of reflections that I think are helpful. One is that the question of technical standards is really crucial, right? And this has actually been a question even pre this current Huawei discussion within the now little known but very important International Telecommunications Union, where there have been lots of discussions over what is a vision of the internet. So even back in 2012, Iran, China, and Russia were bringing forward proposals that foresaw an internet which was much more about, independent sovereign nations having their kind of firewalls, and every nation state would be controlling their own internet, right? And that was roundly voted down by, the US and others. So even in that fractious moment, everyone in US Congress could agree that wasn't their vision of the internet. So these ideas of what the technical standards would be have been debated for quite some time. And in part, this is a recognition by China and others that, those who control technical standards, you control the possibilities of what a technology can be. And that's, a crucial insight that the Germans have with wireless. So they, by creating Telefunken in all sorts of technical ways, they fundamentally change what wireless can be, from being point to point to being point to many. So the Germans wanted to reach as many people as possible, and that technology changes to become what they're looking for, and it helps to set a standard that eventually leads to spoken radio. So I think, for China, this is a recognition of a sort of basic concept, and yes, we can think of that as geopolitical, but that's also true of the US in creating satellites, right? Even in talking about spectrum regulation, is the understanding that controlling those technical standards, those are political decisions. We might call them technical, but they're always very political. So that's the sort of framework that I would put it into. And I think Huawei in some ways fits into that, right? The understanding that if your technical standard is setting the standard, your company is setting the standard, there's always obviously a power to that. What can go alongside that, that's a bigger discussion for, I think, the China experts who know a lot more. But I think I put it into that broader context and say it's not a surprising thing, right? The question is not to see this as a surprise, but to say, what do democracies want to do about that? Recognizing that this seems, within the course of history to be a pretty normal thing for a large nation state that wants global geopolitical power to be doing.
Thank you. We're coming up to the end. It's been a fast hour, and I have a question for Margaret that maybe you could comment on. What would you care to comment about national news influencers? So yeah.
I'll try. Let me see. What direction shall I take that question in? So I guess influencers, we're talking about people on social media.
Well, we certainly see that on social media, whether it's TikTok, YouTube, that people have massive followings and they do shape things. But do you sense that they are having an impact, or is it just a thing?
Yeah. Oh, it's a great question. So one of the things that's super interesting about social media is this debate of what it's really done to our information ecosystem. So has it really enabled everybody to have an equal voice, or is it just that people who are already powerful before now just have another tool? And it's a bit of both, because yes, theoretically anybody can post on social media, but who actually gets attention and who is actually taken to the top of your feed on an algorithm often reflects hierarchies we see in the real world. So, somebody like a president of the US is going to instantly be able to get 10 million followers in a way that, Chris or I are probably not going to be able to, right? So we see some replication of that. On the other hand, we also see some individuals who break out and become incredibly popular. But one of the other things we see looking at questions of, for example, who are the people spreading the most disinformation around, say, COVID, is that it's often a very small number of people with a large number of followers. So one recent report called this the disinformation dozen, which I think is actually quite a helpful way of trying to think about these things, that there are some ways in which a small number of people can often have a really overweening effect on the type of discourse that we see on social media. So there are certain people who can kind of set the standard of what the discussion of the day is going to be. And that in some ways mirrors other types of news media. The other thing that we see, I'll say two more small things about this. One is that, of course, one of the problems we see on social media is that the amount of harassment and hate that you can have against particular types of people, women, people of color, Jewish journalists, lots of examples like that, that can often push people away from wanting to participate in social media at all, because they fear that they too will experience different types of harassment. And this is a problem that in other work I've been investigating, because it's a real question. If you are too worried that your identity means that you will be attacked and you don't even participate in the first place, that's a real problem for our democracy, where we want everybody to be able to participate. And then the final thing I'll say, which is really particular to Canada, is a fascinating study that came out very recently that was looking at who are the people that Canadians follow on Twitter. And only 20% of the people that Canadians follow on Twitter are Canadian. 50% are American. So thinking about that, that's a really interesting thing to think about from a Canadian news perspective. And this study was really looking at COVID and how that makes combating poor quality information around COVID so challenging. If a lot of that is coming from the US, how do you challenge that online with Canadian social media if only 20% of the accounts that Canadians are following are Canadian? So then even the question of, you know, who's a national news influencer in Canada, it becomes really different, because it turns out, you know, Canadians are following a lot of people who are, you know, CNN, or, you know, problematic figures out of the US. So I think that poses such a fascinating question to think about, that is quite different than a world of the 70s and 80s.
Oh, thank you for that. And I see our time is up. It's just coming up to 3. I did get a last second question, but I think we'll leave that. So sorry we were not able to get to that last question, but I have 380 followers on CIC Victoria's Facebook page, so I feel like we're influencing things, but maybe I'm wrong. But this has been a terrific talk, Heidi. It's your book is wonderful, and what you've shared with us today has been absolutely brilliant. It touches on so many interesting things that we can draw parallels to today. So thank you for spending your time with us, because I know you're very busy. And so on behalf of all of us, thank you so much. And for everybody that participated today, thank you for joining us this afternoon on this brilliantly sunshiny day here in Victoria for certain. We have other events coming up soon. On the 28th of April, we'll be looking at the Syrian refugee situation with people from in Turkey through to here, talking about that whole picture of where we sit currently with the Syrian refugee situation. And then on the 4th of May, we switch tact completely, and we start talking about the universal challenges to our food systems and Canada's leadership role. So we've got those and other events coming up really soon. And so do join us. And if you're not a member of CIC, we would love to have you as a member of CIC. So in closing, once more, Heidi, on behalf of everybody here, thank you again. And when things get better, we'll have to have you come over here and give this talk in person. So thank you. And thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks so much for having me.